All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about E.3, which is innate and learned behavior. This will actually it's a different kind of thing than E.2, but in E.3 we're talking a little bit more about psychology, a little bit more about learning and what that is. So what I've done here is written out all six of the objectives for this section, and I wrote all of the command terms in bold. I'm going to circle them just out of good practice. So we've got distinguish and design and analyze and discuss and outline, and one more time, outline. So these are the things that I need to be able to do with this content. So might as well go ahead and get started here. So the first thing is to distinguish between innate and learned behavior. All right, so distinguish means to tell the difference between, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to make a chart. So we're going to have innate behaviors up here and learned behaviors over here on the right. Actually, just a little OCD with the colors. So I'm going to make this a different color. It just helps me stay a little more organized. Okay, so with our innate, there are a couple of things that we would know. Innate is another way of saying it's like an instinct. So we can say it's instinctive, and there are things here that we call FAPs, or fixed action patterns. So essentially, you give a certain stimulus and there is a instinctive or automatic response, as opposed to a learned behavior that is based on experience. Okay, so another point that makes these things that innate cannot be, let's say, cannot be modified by an individual. So you can't choose to change it just because you want to change it, as opposed to a learned behavior that can be changed by the individual, and it's usually based on trial and error. Based on trial and error. The innate behaviors are, oops, wrong orange, are pretty uniform within a population, meaning all individuals of a population have the same or similar type of learning or fixed action potential, whereas opposed to in a learned, there's high variation of different learning within that group. Again, remember, it's based on an individual's experience. So individuals have different experiences. So this is also, as we said, unaffected by the environment. I'm going to abbreviate environment with enviro. And this is highly affected by the environment. The environment can shape different experiences for living things. Additionally, these beneficial behaviors that are instinctive are shaped by natural selection, which is essentially, you might know it as survival of the fittest. But really it's the interplay of survival and reproduction, which survival of the fittest fails to convey, the reproduction part. And as opposed to that, the specific behavior may not be shaped by natural selection, but the capacity for that behavior could be. So some examples of innate behavior include the suckling instinct in newborns, migration of blackcaps around the poles, hunting instincts within a species, whereas learned behavior could be the acquisition of language and social skills, essentially what we're learning in school, what we teach you in school, domesticated behavior in pets, that we train our cats and dogs, or rabbits in my case, or try to train them, and training dolphins or other marine mammals to perform. Those are all learned behaviors. So I hope this helps to highlight some of the differences and to be able to distinguish these. And this should be pretty straightforward. So let's go back to our list of targets. So we did 3.1. 3.2 is to design investigations to investigate innate behavior of invertebrates, including either taxis or kinesis. So I'm not going to write much on this because essentially what you need to be able to do is design a lab. Think of the design section of an IA based on taxis or kinesis. And taxis, and I would jot this down, but I'm not going to write it. But if I were you, I would write this down. Taxis is the innate directional response to stimuli. So positive taxis is when it moves towards that thing, and negative stimulus is when it moves away from something. And oftentimes paramecium is a good example of this. So there are positive thermotaxis. They move towards warm areas of water, and it's negative chemotaxis. They basically avoid high concentrations of chemicals. So they'll move to warm areas or warm pockets of water or away from high concentrations of bad chemicals. And so you can design experiments about this with all kinds of invertebrates. Some of you may have taken this up on your IA number 3, but you may not have. So you need to be able to design an experiment with controlled variables, independent variables, constants, and a strong dependent variable and hypothesis. But be mindful of the animal experimentation policies. But oftentimes people will investigate Euglena or planaria or other related species, pill bugs or sow bugs or roly-polies, that kind of thing, in the invertebrate. And so that's what taxis is. Kinesis is the innate non-directional response to a stimulus. So sometimes it could be the speed of movement is changing or the rate of turning changes, but it's about movement and direction of movement or rate of movement, which is a little different than taxis. But again, you can design an experiment on that. So imagine on paper 3, they might ask you to design a lab based on a certain idea. And you also have to be able to analyze the data, which is more of the DCP kind of thing, but you're not going to be expected to be able to calculate means and standard deviations like you do for an IA, but really perform some kind of math calculation, maybe percentages, maybe ratios, and try to make sense of the data that they would present to you on paper 3. So again, analyzing data that might give you a graph, trying to make sense of it, about these two, about some kind of experiment regarding taxis or kinesis of invertebrates. So, so we do need to talk about some types of learning, and so let's see. Okay. So let me move back over to my open screen so I can do a little bit of writing. So we're going to talk a little bit about 3.4 now. 3.4. All right, so learning. That's what we're talking about here. Learning. That's what we're doing, right? Learning. So there are two major ideas here. There are two major groups: non-associative learning and associative learning. So let's talk about non-associative learning first, and then we'll talk about associative. So our non-associative learning includes these ideas of habituation, which is essentially the idea of getting used to the stimulus over and over again. So getting used to loud noises, getting used to the fuzz that you might hear in a room, just getting used to the stimulus, used to a cold room, used to a warm room. It takes time, but you get used to it and no longer stimulated by that. And then there's also the idea of sensitization. Sensitization, which is essentially the opposite idea, which is the increasing response to a repeated stimulus. So it's a little different, right? It's the opposite effect. But in associative learning, there are a couple of ideas that we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about. Some different ways of associative learning. Simply observing, so watching someone else. There's classical conditioning. There's also operant conditioning. And imprinting. So we'll talk about those three, I'll talk about those four. But really we need to talk about, before we go into details about that, learning for survival. And so many of these innate behaviors are modified through natural selection. There's behaviors that are going to help an individual survive and reproduce, and because it's genetically determined, gets passed down to the next generation, continues to get modified for that environment. So learning is quite essential for survival, learning how to work with the environment, and allows for behaviors to be modified by an individual in response to the environment, giving the survival advantage. So many behaviors have an innate component, such as birdsong, which we'll talk about, but they can be modified by learning. So in classical conditioning, we'll talk about this with Pavlov. Essentially, the idea is that a non-associated stimulus is associated with a natural stimulus, so that it then takes the place of that natural stimulus to get the same response. We'll talk about that with Pavlov in just a moment. In operant conditioning, positive behaviors are rewarded and negative ones are punished. But you get reward as you get closer and closer to the target behavior. So think of training a cat or a dog or a rat or some animal pet. As it does what you want it to do, you reward it more often until it gets to exactly the right behavior, and that's when you would reward it. And then observation is the idea that it can be learning can happen simply by watching another individual, and imprinting, which is learning that it can occur in key periods of development and susceptibility to learning. So think about birds right when they hatch. They may imprint that whatever adult is near them is actually their mother, even if it's a different species, and will follow that individual. That does happen in many, many species. So essentially that's what you need to understand about learning and survival. So Pavlov. So let's talk about Pavlov. So Pavlov has a couple of ideas. But he worked with dogs, and he got dogs to salivate with a bell. So essentially what he did was he had an unconditioned stimulus, So in this case it was food that caused the dogs to salivate. He also had a neutral stimulus, a bell that had no effect by itself, so it does not elicit salivation. And then with when the conditioning happened, basically what he did was he combined the unconditioned stimulus plus the neutral stimulus, um, which then resulted in the salivation or the response from the dogs. The dogs salivated, and then by doing that he created a conditioned stimulus, which was the bell, which is now associated with the unconditioned stimulus to produce salivation. So by pairing a stimulus that had nothing to do with the natural response, the dog started to associate the two, and when the natural stimulus was removed, like food, a bell would trigger salivation within those dogs. So it's kind of interesting. It's neat that this can happen, but it doesn't always happen, and it's hard to think of examples of how we might be working in this way. But you might want to consider your role as a student. How might your role affect learning in a subject? Feedback that you get from a teacher, grades that you get, labs that you have to perform, discussions you have in class. Those are all responses and stimuli for your learning. So think a little bit about if that, then determine if that's operant conditioning or classical conditioning. Okay? And let's just double check that we've got, oh, excuse me, sorry. One moment. So we got to talk about birdsong. That's what we have left to talk about. Birdsong. So birdsong is a strong indicator of reproductive success, and this leads to sexual selection, that a female is going to select a male to reproduce with that has good song. And we can see similarities of songs between species or even species that compete. But there is a period of time after a young bird has hatched in which it has a crude template, which is the innate component. But then there's a sensitive period in which there's some imprinting that happens and some development where the chick is listening and practicing for several days. And then it matures after about 200 days into a song that is very much based on its experiences. So there's a crude template, and then that individual refines that based on its experience. So that crude template is the innate component. The learned component is the listening and practice that it endures for the first 150 or so days of its life. And I think, yep, and that covers it. So I hope that addresses your questions, but if not, please jot them down, bring them to class, and make sure that you ask the questions that you need so we can clear this up. All right, that's all.